This is An Infinite Path, spoken word essays by Niles Heckman, some of which go on to become our documentary short subject films, half of which release freely here through the podcast, all of which can be found through your support at nilesheckman.com.
Do I know what thought is? I haven't got the slightest idea.
The Master and The Carriage is a 42-minute-long, stop-motion animated film made in 1997 by Cyril Lanier, Theresa Goy, and team. It has been both Lanier and Goy's sole film to date. The film is chock full of Gurdjieffian themes, and both of the filmmakers were obviously students of George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, a mystic, philosopher, and spiritual teacher. Gurdjieff's work is certainly highly recommended by this author, and watching this film, which can easily be found online, is a great initial dive into some of his concepts. The story is a metaphoric description of the human inner condition and is tinged with mystery. It begins with a 19th century old-fashioned carriage and driver at the reins of a single horse, which stops in the main square of an unknown city. Night is falling. The carriage driver opens the door expecting to find his master, but a crowd of strangers steps out instead. The driver, upset and confused, seeks help from other carriage drivers.
And you, sir, who's your master? Oh, my master. Now, that's a very good question, but one should perhaps look at it in a more abstract sense, philosophically, in a way to raise the level of the debate, you see.
He comes to discover that he is part of a very ancient allegory, the allegory of man compared to a carriage. Thus begins a mythic adventure, for him to face his own inner obstacles while continuing his search.
I'm puzzled. The words, my horse, my carriage. Words are not enough to think.
He, on his quest, can be overstood at many different levels, for it's very simple but also symbolic of much greater meaning. The story continues by supposing the driver of the horse and carriage has abandoned and forgotten his duties. He is in a public bar, wasting his money, and in a drunken or sleeping state. He thinks that he has the status of the servant, the horse is unfed and weakening, and his reins are in disarray or lost. The carriage has fallen into poor condition. The master is away from the scene and will not return to ride in the carriage until the driver is back up on top of the carriage with everything back in order. This parable exposes an inner human state. We are shown how three components of the self, the body, the emotions, and the mind, are not in balance with one another. In the tale, the carriage represents the human body, the horse represents the emotions or senses, and the driver the intellectual mind. The state of the driver's drunkenness depicts the typical condition of our human minds. It stands for a kind of imagined perception, which is based on sensory perception, past trauma, future expectations, the constant flow of mental images, and how we identify ourselves by our jobs, relationships, possessions, monetary value, etc. In our drunken asleepness, we mechanically shift from one sub-personality to the next, reacting to the perceived influences that affect the image of our personal sovereignty. We are under the illusion that we are anything but masters of ourselves and of our destiny, when in fact we are only when these three basic components of our being are in a harmonious relationship with each other. Body, emotions, and mind are kept out of balance and unsynchronized as the illusion of control flip-flops from one component to the other. According to this tale, what must happen? First, the driver must wake up to overstand his state. He must stop his drunken imaginings and momentarily disidentify from his familiar state of mind long enough to recognize the condition into which he has trapped himself.
Let me suggest that we become your masters. you would work with us and for us. All we would ask in return is that you belong to us, body and soul. So what do you say? Isn't it an appealing prospect?
Then he must leave the public drinking house and go out and repair the carriage, care for his physical body, and attend to the needs of the horse, his emotional self. Once this is done, the driver can lift himself up onto the box on top of the carriage. Then he can regain the reins and hold them firmly in hand, and or be in control of his senses. It is only at this point, when the driver has done everything he can to set things in proper order, that the master can return to the scene and occupy his position within the carriage. However, in this parable, the master does not immediately return and give directions for proceeding. The driver himself must begin the movement of the horse and carriage in the direction that he thinks is best, and then listen intensely for the corrective guidance from the master that's currently not within the carriage. This work is obviously a parable, a simple story to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. Parables through time have existed to convey a story with mass appeal that functions on multiple levels. It allows the more studied and experienced to catch the deeper meanings, while the majority look at it superficially. In that sense, fiction has a certain multidimensional power over a lecture or essay. A good parable requires mental process that takes place in the mind trying to decipher it. There are some very nice and straightforward parables penned by Leo Tolstoy, for example, author of War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Some of the most widely read parables are Christian, yet seem to be more difficult to realize for many. Parables by Gurdjieff can be even more encoded and challenging to decipher, such as the tale told in his very overly complex book, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which one could say is terribly written, but one in the know could also say contains deep secrets of the mystery encoded within it. Thus, what takes the most effort to get can also have the most impact. Much of the books of Gurdjieff and his students were transferred from the Upanishads, which were philosophical books of the Vedas written around 1000 to 600 BC from unknown sources in India.
In ancient times, the course of the sun across the sky was often likened to that of a carriage drawn by winged horses and driven by the sun god. According to ancient tradition, man contains within himself the sun, the planets, the entire cosmos. In early India, the sacred writings compare the structure of man to that of a carriage.
A takeaway from these lessons are summed up perfectly by P.D. Ouspensky, one of Gurdjieff's most known students, when he said, "Our fundamental idea is that man is not a complete being, that nature develops him to a certain point and then leaves him to develop further to his own efforts and devices, or to live and die as he was born, to denigrate and lose the capacity for development. The evolution of man means the development of certain inner qualities and features which usually remain undeveloped and which cannot develop by themselves. Observation shows that this development is only possible under certain definite conditions, with efforts of a certain kind, and with sufficient help from others who have already attained a certain knowledge of such methods." This particular parable of the horse and the carriage is of extraordinary depth and insight. It illustrates an indispensable agent in initiating the changes in conditions that leads to awakening within our higher awareness, places in which the human will plays a critical role. It is the will which directs attention and allows certain thoughts and emotions to shape our sense of identity, implementing conscious effort versus unconscious mechanical ideas. It is therefore through an active will that we are able to disidentify from old familiar personality states and awaken enough to recognize from a different point of view than the hopeless condition into which we had placed ourselves. This is accomplished through the systematic practice of an exercise Gurdjieff called self-observation, which he derived from the Upanishads. It is the matter of creating a kind of inner separation so that one can stand aside and watch the self interact with life. which the driver must go off and do in this tale himself. The charm and apparent naivete in this short film are deceptive, for through these acts of will, the viewer, like the carriage driver, may well be called into posing a serious question. Am I the master of myself?
The space inside is as boundless as the space outside. Is there a force that leads back to the source? Master, we've arrived.